Okay, so I think that we can start. Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome. Today, our guest is Professor Marcela Andokova. Marcela works at the Department of Classical and Semitic Philology at Comenius University in Bratislava. In her research, she focuses on classical and ancient Christian literature and also Latin education in the context of European schooling. Tonight, she's going to talk about St. Augustine and his take on superstition. So, Marcela, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by citing Augustine's words from the seventh tractate of his commentary on the Gospel of St. John, where the Bishop of Hippo says, "When you have a headache, we praise you if you have put the books of Gospels to your head instead of having recourse to an amulet." And I really like this citation, both in English as well as in original Latin text, because the English translation made by Edmund Hill preserves the beauty of Augustine's language when he uses assonance or a kind of rhyme at the end of the members of the periods. So, what does this citation tell us about the relationship between science, religion, and superstition? Can we suppose that Augustine, who has been a bishop for practically more than 10 years, would suggest that his believers, that people from his community use such superstitious practices when they are ill? No one, I guess, would believe that. But why does he say something like that in a homily preached in his episcopal see of Hippo during the Sunday liturgy? I mean, we are quite surprised. And my aim in this presentation is to show that he is not inconsistent in his thinking, but he simply pays attention to his community and he understands how people's minds operate and how magic and all superstitious practices in his time were spread all around, not only his community, but all around the known world, especially in North Africa, where he lived. So let's have a look at the place of magic in Greco-Roman world. And I would start here by quoting Robert Marcus, who, when presenting a neglected semiotic theory in De Doctrina Christiana, written by Augustine, he says that the practice of magic was ubiquitous in antiquity. Theorizing about it was rare. I mean, that's what I have already suggested. Magic was practically everywhere. It was infiltrated into religion. It was infiltrated into everyday life of contemporary people. And here I refer also to another article written by Fritz Graf, who is slightly opposing Marcus's theory, presented in his article on Augustine's magic. And he is suggesting in his article, written some 8 years later, that magic is something based on the community of speech between natural and supernatural or superhuman beings, i.e. immortal gods. It means that the magic operates through language. Not a ritual is important. I mean, ritual is always accompanying the words, the language, but the language, the speech of the magician makes the spell really efficient. So we can look at how Augustine views this topic in his famous work, De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine, which he wrote, partly, because first 3 books he completed just shortly after his episcopal ordination in 396, 397, and he proposes a kind of Christian education in his book, which is focusing on exegesis and hermeneutics. And in the second book, where he talks about Christian culture based on the Bible, not anymore on liberal arts, in chapters 20 to 24, he discusses all kinds of superstition, where all practices like magic, amulets, astrology, or other kinds of futilities acknowledged by the state, like augurs or haruspiki, for example, are mentioned. So all this is being refuted in these chapters by Augustine. And he says everything what is instituted by people in order to create contact with demons, or in order to worship other creatures, is considered to be superstition or magic. So for Augustine, this is obvious. When he starts his episcopal career, he understands that the first thing he should do is to promote Christian culture based on the Bible, not on pagan teaching, which he was a famous promoter of. And in the end, on the bottom of this slide, you can see that all these superstitious practices he mentions in this paragraph, he mentions under the title of physica or physic, saying that people would call it physic in order to simulate that it comes from nature and that it has nothing to do with superstition. So this is how this magical, religious, and scientific practice could be brought together. In these chapters, again, from the Doctrina Christiana, book 2, we can read about another superstitious practice, which is the practice of astrology. Astrologers, or genetliaci, are those who make horoscope at the moment of a childbirth. We know that this was a practice very, no, I am not saying dear, but very spread around Greco-Roman world. And we know, for example, that the Emperor Hadrian was such a good astrologer that he was even able to predict the moment of his own death in his horoscope. Of course, those who would try to find the information about his horoscope would be put to death. So who would dare it anyway? But we can see that horoscopes were really popular. That's why Augustine devotes a certain space in his book to this topic. And as I said, this treatise Augustine wrote shortly after his ordination, was meant to promote Christian culture based on biblical truth, because, as he says, all important and necessary knowledge for a Christian can be found in the Bible. And again, in the Bible, both in the Old and the New Testament, we can find the texts that prohibit the magic in Israel, and then in New Testament milieu. We can see those citations especially in books like the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And here, all of these mentions are based on one important thing. All sorcerers or necromancers, all wizards and witches are to be sentenced by death if they practice these charms and these magical rites. So they even should be stoned to death with stones if ever they do proceed or pursue these magical arts, artes magicae. It means that apparently this practice was known to Israelites and was commonly practiced, but at the same time was prohibited. In the New Testament, one important citation comes from Apostle Paul, from the first letter to Corinthians, 10:20, where we read that Christians should not have communion with demons, because all pagan rites, whenever we offer sacrifice to pagans, we offer sacrifice to demons. I will come back to this citation again in the end of my presentation. So, what does Augustine say about these superstitious practices in his Confessions? Because Confessions, in fact, were written approximately the same time and as his De Doctrina Christiana. So he started writing the 13 books of his Confessions in 397 and finished approximately 401. And that's, I am saying it not just by chance, but on purpose, underscoring the fact that Augustine at this time was really reflecting upon his pagan and Christian practices and about things which were common for the people in his community, as we will see again in the end of my talk. And he is confessing in the first chapters of book 4 how important astrology was in his younger age, especially during the time of his Manichaean years, because between his 19th and 28th year of his life, he was adherent to Manichaean sect, and during this time he practiced astrology, but he wouldn't consent to pay money to a sorcerer who would like to offer sacrifice to gods in order that Augustine wins a poetic competition. So this was obvious for Augustine that this magic was harmful. We can see that for Augustine, it was clear that there are two kinds of magic or superstition in general. The one which constitutes communion with the demons, which should be condemned at first sight, and then something which is based on natural laws, which enters into the realm of cosmology or world harmony, and that can be more acceptable than the first one. And then he is obviously refuting this practice, but he does not refute astrology as it is. And he mentions in the next chapter his friend Vindicianus, who was a physician, but in earlier age, at an earlier age, he practiced astrology himself and was a very good astrologer, but then he switched to medicine. And here probably Augustine's interest in medicine, not only in astrology, can be dated, because Augustine was exchanging letters with these Vindicianus, where they were talking about different medical practices. And they were discussing the questions of astrology, of the questions of making horoscopes, for which genetliaci are responsible. And again, he's asking his friend, Vindicianus, how is it possible that things which are predicted by these astrologers can come true? And that's very important. Augustine does not refute this practice because it's not efficient. He, as we can see on this slide, obviously understands that it can happen what the astrologer predicts, but as his friend Vindicianus is saying, seems very convincing to Augustine. It happens due to chance, vim sortis, something which is very powerful in our world, in our lives. So this is one of the things which we can see. Augustine is pondering, reflecting a lot upon this topic. He is the man, very open-minded, we would say, who does not refute something because someone has ordained it. He is refuting something because he has come to the conclusion that it's not good. And it will help us understand why the first citation I quoted was possible to be put in his mouth some 5-7 years later. Okay, what happens? Augustine reflects on the topic of magic also in his De Civitate Dei, the city of God. It's his masterpiece, written much later than Confessions. And here, Augustine is talking about Apuleius. Apuleius was famous for his magical craft and for his theory presented in his book Apologia per se de Magia. And he was even condemned to death, but then he managed to defend himself anyway. And Augustine, in his De Civitate Dei, refers to this Apuleius in order to say that for these thinkers, these pagan thinkers, there exists no direct communication between God or gods and man. Men need intermediaries who would bring their prayers or their petitions to gods, and then they need these intermediaries in order to bring the answers from gods to the people. And here Augustine refers to Plato, who says that there is no direct intercourse between man and between man and gods. So that's why people practiced magic. And if we understand a little bit the Roman pagan religion, we would consent to this, because in ancient Rome, people were not communicating directly with gods. They were offering them sacrifices through the priests. They were not directing their preces, their prayers to gods, but usually they were doing it through someone. So if we, in the book of Levi, in his history of Rome, we read that Scipio Africanus was a superstitious man because he was sitting every day in the temple of Jupiter Maximus Optimus on the Capitolian Hill. It would mean that for people this was a superstitious practice because he was communicating directly with Jupiter. So here Augustine is referring to these Roman practices, and in the next chapter of book 8 he continues saying even that although magic was practiced all around the ancient Roman world, it was anyway condemned by the state from the very beginnings. And he refers to Cicero's saying that already in the mid-5th century before Christ, in the first laws, duodecim tabulae legum, it was written that those who practiced magic should be put to death. So it was obvious in the Roman world that magic was not the thing that should be practiced during the daylight. We know that all negotiations, all serious work, like the sessions of the Senate, if we can call it a serious job, were held during the day. So it started after the sunrise and it finished before the sunset. Magical rites were practiced during the night because they were obscene. They were the means of communication with supernatural forces that were not acknowledged by the mainstream religious practice. And here, on the bottom of the slide, we have citation, direct citation from the Apollos, his book, where we read that magician, magus, is the one who has communion of speech with immortal gods. Communio loquendi cum dis immortalibus. So that's what Augustine suggested in his City of God. So, what do we learn about magical practices, for example, in Plato's Laws? His 11th book of the Laws is of particular interest to us, and it goes in line with what we have said about the punishment of those practicing these magical arts. Plato calls this magical practice pharmakeia, which means that he calls it a poisonous practice, so poisoning. And we know that pharmakon was not only a healing medicine, but it was also a poison. So here he says that there are two kinds of these ways of using pharmakeia. And the first one is injuring someone by someone else using natural means. It means like the doctor would use, instead of a real medicine, would use a poison. And then the second one would be using of the magic, using of spells, incantations, and other kinds the sorcerers practice. And in the next lines of his book 11, we could read that those like doctors, medical doctors, who practice this pharmakeia should be put to death if accused of killing someone by this art. And those who practice it in private should get the punishment the judge would consider the right for them. But anyway, those who practice sorcery or magical rites should be put to death again. So we can see that already the Greeks were very strict about this. And in this book, 11th book of his laws, he continues explaining another harmful effect magic has on human minds. People's minds are harmed by being frightened by this magic and spells. And he uses the example of waxen figures one can find at the doorway, or one can find on the crossroads, or on the tombs of their parents. And people wouldn't refute this magical practice because they are uneducated. They are so simple that they are unable to recognize this false practice. So there are two things which we should take into consideration. The magic, as we know it from the testimonies of ancient authors, would function only through the language. So it's a community of speech. So if one does not communicate with magicians, sorcerers, etc., nothing bad could happen to them. Or it can function only if one is frightened and pays attention to these magical practices. We could find many examples of this kind in ancient authors, both in pagan authors, Greek and Latin ones, as well as in Christian authors. But I always refer to those articles and papers I mentioned in my bibliography in the end of this presentation. But of course, you can read many of them. But for our purposes, it would be useful to continue a little bit further on and stop somewhere in the 1st century Rome. So during the first decades of the Roman Empire, when Pliny the Elder wrote his Naturalis Historia. In this work, he often refers to medical practices. He often criticizes medical doctors, especially those coming from the Greek world, saying that their practices, like butchers' practices, are sometimes so painful that it's better to die than to be in hands of them. And he often have recourse to the practice of using herbs better than of the practices used by medical doctors. And in the beginning of book 30, he offers us his view of magic. And he says that it has the greatest influence because it connects, or it is bound with 3 other important elements. The first one is that it arose from the medicine. So we can see how medicine as techne in antiquity was viewed being close to magic. Then it is bound with religion, which is still obscure in the eyes of Pliny's contemporaries, as we can see in this citation. And finally, it is bound with superstition, so with those who make horoscopes at our birth, because there is no one who wouldn't like to know his or her destiny. So, in this book, we can clearly understand that techne of medicine was not considered a science a real science, though in Varros disciplinae we have not 7 artes, but 9, including precisely architecture and medicine. But on the other hand, with medicine, we have close link with magic, which is to be condemned as well. So, how does it operate in medical books? Abracadabra. I guess there is no one among us who wouldn't know this word, who wouldn't read this in a fairy tale, and or who wouldn't see it in a film. Yes, abracadabra, the expression that probably comes from Aramaic, and it expresses something like abra and cadabra, which means abra, I will create as I speak, is the special spell which can be found, not surprisingly, in the medical book Liber Medicinalis by Serenus Sammonicus. Quintus Serenus Sammonicus, who was the tutor to such an emperor like Geta or even Caracalla, wrote in hexameters, 1,119 hexameters, he wrote a book on medicine where he uses this spell, abracadabra, in order to cast out the fever, which was probably the fever provoked by endemic malaria. Quintus Serenus Sammonicus died in 212, and we know that first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire were marked by the influx of many migrants from all around the world. And these people who came to search their fortune in Rome, many a time had to die because of this endemic malaria. And of course, many people were not rich enough to have a possibility to ask the doctor for help. So they often had recourse to these magical practices. And here we can see this magical practice, abracadabra, which had to be recited as many times as there are the letters in this word. And then you should put this spell around the neck of the patient in order to cast out the fever. So, medicine and magic all together. We can understand it. People who are uneducated, and there are still in the first centuries of the Roman Empire, still many people who are illiterate, so many people who are in need, who are poor, and for them it's always easier to have recourse to an amulet or to sorcerer's help than to pay big money for medical treatment. And how does it concern with the topic I presented in the beginning of my presentation? We can see the citation from another sermon preached by Augustine, probably in 397, so also shortly after his ordination, shortly after his De Doctrina Christiana Book 2 was written and circulated among the people. And we can see in this sermon preached on the occasion of the feast of the Martyr Quadratus on the 21st of August, and it was probably held in Carthage, so the capital city of the province, how Augustine, shortly after his ordination, rejects all superstitious practices, and of course magic itself. Here we can see that he understands that people should give up their pagan practices. He is a young bishop, full of energy, full of ideas and ideals, and he thinks that no matter whether people are healed from their illness, whether they are cured or not, that they shouldn't have recourse to these magical practices. So he says that you are lying in your bed, you are fighting in the arena. Arena here means their conscience, where people have to fight with the devil. And you have the chance to win your fight if you reject, we would say, the temptation of your biggest enemy, of the devil. If you do not consent to have recourse to these magical practices, you better die and you will finish as a martyr. So he is comparing the real martyrs of first 3 centuries of Christian era with those who have to reject temptations from the devil, who are also a kind of martyrs, although they will not get the crown of martyrs as those who died really fighting with beasts, etc. So this is important for us. Young bishop does not accept any superstitious practice because people should forget about it. They should rely solely upon God, and God will be their only help, no matter whether they die or whether they recover from the illness. But the only hope they should put is in God. He continues in this sermon 306 and says that it is precisely this what makes martyr of us. The one who made you is watching you, and the one who called you is helping you. So thanks to God's help, you can win this fight. And again, we can see, like in the first citation I mentioned in the beginning, that Augustine is, as a good rhetor and teacher of rhetoric, he used to be at his earlier age, is very attentive to the way he's saying these things. They have the function, let's say, of a slogan, something which should be remembered. These words are not there just to be pronounced, but his people should remember them. So that's why we can see in this part of the quote all the epiphors, you, and you. And we can also see it in the Latin text. And now, this happened probably in 397, as Dolbo suggested, because this sermon was one of the newly discovered sermons by Dolbo. And 10 years, or 11 years, more precisely speaking, later, Augustine preaches this homily on John's Gospel, on the first chapter, and it is, again, our 7th tractate from these homilies. And here, Augustine explains why he accepts the practice of putting the gospel on the head. He's saying, I admit that it being possible, not because the gospel, the book of gospels, were made to this purpose, but because it is much better than to have recourse to amulets. So what does it tell us about maturing man as Augustine was? We should realize that Augustine, so to speak, was a kind of influencer in late antique world, and his sermons and homilies served as statuses on our social That's so, imagine, he was so influential that it was also already after his death, but in 431, there was the Council of Ephesus in the East, and Augustine was the only Catholic bishop from the West who was invited to participate. But of course, the invitation came too late. He had already died in 430. But we can see that here Augustine is approving of this practice because it's something which promotes God's realm, which promotes Christian teaching. So if we put gospel on our head, and if we pray with gospels, if we read the Bible, we will have the education we need in order to live good lives and deserve eternal life. And I would permit to give one testimony from our contemporary Slovakia. We are surprised maybe at seeing what Augustine wrote, but some 30 years ago in Slovakia, in some villages in the countryside, people, when they had problems, troubles of health, they often came to ask their priest, their parish priest, to give them a piece of his ornate in order to put it under the cushion, for example, of their children who could not sleep during the night. And imagine, this is a very similar practice as the one Augustine is commenting on. So, to conclude my presentation, I would come back again to his semiotic theory, his theory of science, presented in the second book of De Doctrina Christiana. And here, everything is stated clearly. We should reject, refuse all practices which are not in accordance with the promulgation of God's laws, which do not help to promote the love of God and the love of neighbor in the world. So all those medical, or let's say superstitious practices, which do not promote love of God and neighbor, are pursued in order to gain private gains, should be rejected. So that's the principle or basic difference between magical and religious practices in his community. Religious practices, even putting the gospel books on one's head, do not harm Christians, but promote Christian faith. Because if one is healed, it would help the Christian community to believe even more in this Christian, in this God. And those practices which are pursued in order to have temporal goods are to be refuted. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marcela. It was wonderful talk. Now I will open the discussion. So any questions from our audience? Anybody? Or should I start with the comments and questions? Okay, so yeah, I will open the discussion. I found the whole talk fascinating, and there is I have two thoughts and probably questions out of it. One is that Augustine endorsed medical practices. So medicine is legit way of healing. And I was wondering whether the demarcation, so the way to distinguish between proper medical practice and going for forbidden ones, magical ones, would be that the natural medicine relies on some sort of natural mechanical causes like herbs, and the forbidden one is invoking spirits or some agents to help us out. Probably he would say something like that, because to make the distinction. So that's one thing. And the other thing that also crossed my mind when you mentioned the case in Slovakia villages nowadays. The context is slightly different when we compare it to Augustine, right? Because in his days, he said that putting the gospel on the head is actually it's better than using any of these forbidden techniques, magic, amulets, incantations, and all of that, because it's benevolent. The former is violating our connection with God, and it's kind of disturbing this universe, and it can do us harm, because these forces exist and they can harm us when we get in touch with them. And that's why he's suggesting, well, put the gospel on the head. But nowadays I'm thinking a priest would be, he would say, well, that's superstition, don't do it. It's because the context is different. We don't really have these magical forces anymore. So that this is more benevolent way of doing things. It's like you just pray to God and pray to him that his will is done. And that's pretty much it. So yeah, so these are my thoughts and comments and some questions. So yeah.
Okay, can I react to that?
Yes.
The problem is that I'm pretty interested in these practices even nowadays. And I can say that you mentioned, I'm not quoting, but paraphrasing your words, that there are no more superstitious and magical practices as they were in antiquity.
There are.
But there are plenty of. I know a lady who is a very successful businesswoman, let's say, and she wouldn't start a new business, or she wouldn't enter into contract with anyone without consulting a numerologist. And you would say, how is this possible? And I mean, these practices I've seen all around the world when I've been traveling, also for my professional purposes. But I can say that the problem is with this priest and these people. For them, it has the same virtue, the same value. You know, the gospel on your head is not made for that. You should read the Gospels, you should pray with the Gospels, but not put them on head. But Augustine is, I would say, making concession to human weakness, to human feebleness. He understands what my point was to show that shortly after his ordination, he wouldn't probably consent to this, as we saw in the sermon 306. But later, when he saw how much these practices were common and were in practice, that he would make this concession. He would say, okay, it's better if they put the gospel than if they put the amulet on their heads. So for me, it's not so distinct. It's not so far from each other, but it was a very good observation. Thanks for that. And what concerns Augustine's interest in medicine, we even know that he assisted to one operation, medical operation, and he himself had problems with his health. When he was in Milan, we know that he had some problems with breathing, And imagine a rhetor without a microphone. How could he speak and how could he pursue his career? It is possible that all these things and other factors would affect August or would contribute to Augustine's interest in medicine. And definitely he was interested in science, in the things called or taken under the name of physica. And for him, medicine would be already a science. But as we saw in the case of Serenus, Sammonicus Serenus, it was not that clear 200 years before Augustine. So that's what is interesting, that with the evolution of science, of medical science, also the distinctions became clearer. Thank you.
Thank you. Rastko, you have a question, please.
Thank you, and thank you for a very interesting talk. This was really, really informative for me because I guess it's a rare topic to be heard. So I was trying to think of an explicit criterion, let's say, to actually understand what is the let's say the essence of this kind of pessimistic interpretation, I could say, of these pagan practices, because I'm not sure that it's easy to locate this essence of the problem. Why are these practices absolutely bad? For instance, it seems to me that some of these interpretations could be that Augustine, at least his starting interpretation is kind of pessimistic. So let's say it seems to me that, for instance, if some kind of pseudo communication is the problem, so by doing these rituals or whatever, we are trying to communicate with beings that don't actually exist, for instance. So why, if this is the case, why is it, let's say, more plausible to say that by doing these practices we are then communicated with demons or with the devil, and not communicating with God or angels, if you understand what I mean. So in the case of black magic, for instance, you could say that there is some kind of ill intention in communication, but I would say that for most of the people who are doing these rituals, they don't have an ill intention. They are doing this for some kind of benefit. So why would this be understood as bad a priori? For instance, it could be, I mean, it could be interpreted in a more optimistic way, and it could Christianity could find something good in this kind of ritual. That's my point. And actually, this is kind of, let's say, what actually happened in this later quote with the gospel on the head. I think that it seems to me that maybe Augustine became more tolerant towards the end of his life, when he actually understood that he cannot make a clear cut, maybe because there are some habits, collective habits of people, which cannot be really erased. So, I mean, maybe one last thing. So maybe the sacrifice was the problem. So these unnecessary sacrifices are maybe the thing. But did I understand correctly that he doesn't feel that there is anything wrong with astrology, precisely because there are no sacrifices and there is no pseudo communication with the spirits? And so thank you very much. I hope that I was clear enough.
Thank you very much for your comments and questions. To make myself clearer, Augustine was not against astrology at his early age. I mean, when he was adherent to the Manichaean sect, so he was in his 20th, roughly speaking, he was not against making horoscopes because he found it a kind of pseudoscience, we could call it now, maybe. So it was not about offering sacrifices to gods, as you said. So that's why he was interested in it. And moreover, he was not against because he saw that these horoscopes very often gave true information to people. And Augustine was very curious himself. Out of curiosity, he was doing so many things. Even his conversion started out of curiosity, because when he was in Milan teaching rhetoric on the imperial court, he started to attend Ambrose's homilies out of curiosity, and then he converted to Christianity. But okay, so for him, it was more acceptable practice. But when he became a Christian, when he was baptized in 387, then he started to reject systematically all pagan practices, including making horoscopes. So this was obvious. That's why he includes this practice of making horoscopes as a superstitious practice, which should be rejected by true Christians in his De Doctrina Christiana too, as I mentioned. Then you asked about the rituals. Yes, for us, if there are no demons, if we do not believe in gods or God, okay, these are practices done in vain. Okay, but for the ancient people of Augustine's times, of course, gods or God existed, and it was necessary to communicate with gods. And I didn't have so much time to explain it more in detail, but as I mentioned, first of all, ancient Romans did not communicate with gods directly. It was not like sitting in a church, praying to God, having conversation with him, but during the Roman Empire, it started to change thanks to these, I would call it exotic practices like Mithraism, Judaism, Christianity, or the cult of Isis brought to Rome, and all these cults promulgated communication with God. Suddenly things are changing. We can have a relationship with the God. So that's why we do not need any demonic, diabolic intermediary, as we saw in Plato, for example, because we can communicate with our God directly. And then all these unnecessary practices are either harmful or evil or unnecessary, if I answer your question properly. Would you like to add something to that?
I just wanted to add what Marcela was saying, that the thing is that superstitious practices back then were not bad because they were in vain, as Marcela said, because they were addressed to non-existent powers or tried to invoke non-existent powers. They were harmful because they would invoke demons that are behind them, and people tried to use demons basically to go around God and heal themselves, or get the promotion, or do something that they wanted to do in their lives. And in that way, they would harm their souls. And that's why Augustine, or other, like 2 centuries after Augustine, we have John and Barsadoufius in Gaza, 2 desert fathers, who also advised people in Gaza, Christians in Gaza, not to go to magicians or sorcerers, because that would harm their souls. So it's not because it's inefficient or in vain, it's because it harms you. Because these are existent creatures that are evil.
Thank you. Sorry, you can say first.
Yeah, but this is precisely what I'm talking about. So maybe people don't actually know what they are doing. They don't know who are trying to communicate with, right? But I'm not sure why should we, let's say, as Christians, assume that every kind of this attempt of at communication goes finishes as some kind of attempt at communication with demons or the devil. So maybe these people don't know what they are doing, but I would say that there is like pretty much a good chance to try to communicate with an angel. Why should it always be a communication with something negative? That's what I'm calling this pessimistic kind of the pessimistic interpretation of these kind of rituals. It seems to me that it need not it's not necessary for the communication to be directed towards something bad, any kind of bad entity. It could be maybe be directed towards angels, for instance, even though we are pagans.
Yeah, I understand. I really like your expression, this pessimistic view. Thank you for that. I understand, but at the same time, the communication with the demons for Augustine, like for his contemporaries, Christian contemporaries, it was obvious that communication with other supernatural beings than God would be communication with demons. Because, as I said in my presentation, Augustine did not say that, for example, unlike Origen in his Contra Celsum, Origen is saying that all superstitious practices are vain and they are to be condemned as they are, all of them. And no matter whether we talk about astrology or magic or spells, whatever. But Augustine, he is accepting that these superstitious practices can be useful, can be efficient. I mean, he knows his community very well. And, maybe I have had contact in my professional life with different professionals from, for example, Africa. I met one Nigerian man who was a member of parliament, and I met him in Europe, and he was a smart Christian, very educated man of letters, and he was wearing, as a Christian, he was wearing an amulet on his neck, because he said that it protects him from evil spells or evil forces, evil powers. And that's precisely what reminded me of Augustine's contemporaries. They, on the one hand, were already baptized, were Christians, but on the other hand, continued in the same ways, because we are often afraid of many things which could happen. Augustine, in his second book of De Doctrina Christiana, mentions, for example, if when you are putting on your shoes and you sneeze, the superstition says you must go to bed directly. Imagine that this happens to us these days. I must go to university, but this happens to me, and I go back home and lie in bed. And he's mentioning loads of similar practices there. And imagine how these practices function as binding spells, we can call them in English, which would bind us, I wouldn't say thanks to which, but because of which we wouldn't be free. He understands that an astrologer could tell the truth about our future destiny. But if it's something not good, it can affect our future lives. And that's why we should reject it. There was no space for that, but for example, in the Acts of Apostles, we would also have different mentions of this kind, that a girl who would tell the fortunes, tell the future, should be rejected, not because she's not saying what is true, but because she is doing it thanks to demonic powers. So the apostle cast out the demon. So that is why we should avoid these practices, because they wouldn't make us free, if I understand it properly. But thanks for your comments.
I would like to say something as well, Liliana, if you have. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, definitely.
Yes. Nice. Yeah. Thank you, Marcela, for your really nice lecture, and it is what we needed really in this series of our lectures. But I would say something first about still to stay on the question Rastko put. My idea is that when we refer to the supernatural beings, and your question was why it is pessimistic, why would not we ask something from angels or or such supernatural being, but necessarily
yes, even by chance.
Demons. Yeah.
Even by chance, we don't know what they're doing if we're pagans.
Yeah, but my idea is that it depends. Also, it would depend on the intention of one who asks something. If you have a good intention, if you have really a good affection to God, if you believe rightly, yeah, it is more probably that you will be in contact with angels, as in saints and others. But if your idea, it is most often case to predict future, or to have some impact on natural physics, natural developments, medical. It is a other case. Yes, because I think that this intention is very, very important of those who ask for something from supernatural beings.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Definitely.
if I can elaborate just a second. So if I'm a pagan and I'm doing some kind of ritual, obviously, if from the perspective of a Christian, I cannot communicate with some kind of supernatural being, even though I maybe think that this being exists. So from a Christian perspective, this being does not exist. But if I have a good kind of intention, in any way, as Professor said, why wouldn't this ritual be some kind of a communication with a Christian angel? That was maybe my point. So my intention is good. So even though I'm pagan, why is it impossible for me to communicate with some good being and not with a demon?
I think that for Augustine or some, it would not be possible to have good intention if you're pagan or something. Yeah, it is what is needed. Yes, to have a very right kind of faith. Yes, and to have to God. Yes. So I think it would be very difficult. Yes, to have good intention as pagan. Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. Sorry, because if you are a pagan, you would worship your gods. I mean, for example, you would have a little, but a woman would have a newborn baby, and she would be afraid that the baby dies, because mortality was very high in ancient Rome. after the birth. So she would invoke different goddesses in order to get help from them. And of course, for Christians then, this would be recourse to demonic powers, because according to Augustine's thinking, all these practices are demonic ones. So, I mean, it's incompatible, because pagans would have recourse to their gods, and they could have recourse even to Christian God. I mean, it would be possible because they might know him from their neighbors. But anyway, it should be a recourse to a real God. So, I mean, we cannot intermingle pagan and Christian practices, although Christians were mixing up with these pagan practices, of course, at Augustine's times.
Thank you.
You wanted to add?
Okay, so I think we can wrap it up. And I would like to thank Marcela once again for giving us such an informative, wonderful lecture. So stay tuned. We have one more. David Ellis will be speaking on Tuesday, and we will circulate the time and the link on time. And this lecture will be recorded. Well, it's recorded, but it will be prepared and posted in a couple of days. So we'll have it on the website too. Thank you again, Marcela, and
thank you, Marcela.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your comments and questions. Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a nice evening to